Zainab stood at the edge of the narrow veranda, her hands gripping the wooden railing as she gazed out at the fading sun. The golden light cast a warm glow over the dusty streets of Kano, where merchants packed up their goods and the scent of roasted groundnuts filled the evening air. It should have been a moment of peace, but inside her heart, a storm raged. Her mother's voice echoed from inside the house, sharp and final. "Zainab, come inside. You must prepare yourself. Your father will not hear another word of protest." Zainab clenched her fists. She had begged, pleaded, and even wept at her father's feet, but his mind was set. By the next moon, she would be the wife of Alhaji Ibrahim, a man nearly twice her age, whose wealth had made him a legend in the market squares. The marriage was a transaction, a union built on status and security. But it was not love. Love was Musa. The thought of him sent a sharp pain through her chest. Musa, the son of a modest tailor, the boy who had stolen her heart under the neem tree by the river, where they whispered dreams of a future together. A future that now lay in ruins. Her feet moved before she could think. She slipped into the street, her scarf pulled low over her face as she rushed toward the outskirts of the town. She had to see him, one last time. When she arrived at the riverbank, he was already there, as if he had known she would come. His tall frame was rigid with tension, his dark eyes filled with unspoken words. "You're really going through with this?" His voice was hoarse. Tears burned at the back of her throat. "I have no choice." Musa shook his head, stepping closer. "You always have a choice, Zainab." She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "My father will never allow us to be together. If I refuse, my family will suffer." A bitter laugh escaped his lips. "So you choose wealth over love?" Her heart cracked. "I choose survival." Musa stared at her for a long moment before exhaling shakily. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pendant, the one he had carved for her last Ramadan. He pressed it into her palm, his fingers lingering. "Keep this, if you ever remember what we had." Zainab swallowed hard, closing her fingers around the pendant. "I will always remember." But as she turned and walked away, she knew memories would not be enough to save her from the life she was about to enter. The day of Zainab's wedding arrived too soon. She sat in front of the mirror as her mother secured the gold-embroidered veil over her head. The scent of jasmine oil filled the air, mixing with the aroma of freshly baked kunu cakes being prepared in the courtyard. Outside, the compound bustled with women singing and ululating, celebrating the grand occasion. But inside, Zainab felt nothing but emptiness. Her reflection stared back at her, adorned in the finest silk, her wrists heavy with gold bangles, her lips painted a soft shade of crimson. She looked every bit the perfect bride. A wealthy man's prize. "Don't look so miserable," her mother whispered, adjusting the folds of her gown. "Alhaji Ibrahim is a good man. He will take care of you." Zainab swallowed the bitterness rising in her throat. "Take care of me?" As though she were a child who needed to be fed and clothed rather than a woman capable of choosing her own fate. She thought of Musa. Did he hate her now? Had he given up on the love they had nurtured in secret for so many years? A knock sounded at the door, and her father's voice followed. "It is time." The ceremony passed in a blur. The vows were spoken. The blessings were given. Hands pressed into hers in congratulations. And just like that, she was no longer Zainab, the girl who had dreamed of love beneath the neem trees. She was now Hajia Zainab, wife of Alhaji Ibrahim. That night, as she sat in the vast chambers of her new home, the weight of reality settled on her shoulders. The silk sheets beneath her felt cold, the air heavy with unfamiliarity. Her husband entered, his presence filling the room. He was not unkind. His touch was not cruel. But as he claimed her as his wife, Zainab closed her eyes and let herself drift into another place, another time, where a young man whispered promises of forever beneath the stars. A time that no longer belonged to her. Years later, the facade of happiness did not last. Zainab learned to play the role of the dutiful wife, but behind the closed doors of her gilded cage, loneliness festered. Alhaji Ibrahim grew distant, his attention drawn to business ventures and younger women. Then, the inevitable happened. One evening, he came home with a new bride. A girl barely past childhood, her eyes wide with the same fear Zainab had once known. The humiliation burned like fire in Zainab's chest, but she remained silent. Until she could bear it no more. The air inside Musa's shop was thick with the scent of fabric and dye, but beneath it, Zainab could still detect something else: resentment, cold and unyielding. Musa stood before her, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his jaw set in a way that made it clear he had long buried the past. The boy who had once looked at her with adoration was gone. In his place stood a man hardened by betrayal. Zainab swallowed the lump in her throat. I had nowhere else to go. A bitter smile ghosted Musa's lips. And you think I'm the place you run to? He let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. How convenient. She flinched. His words cut deep, but she couldn't blame him. She had broken him once. She had chosen security over love. And now, standing in front of him, stripped of everything, her wealth, her marriage, her pride, she realized she had lost far more than she ever gained. I never stopped thinking about you, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Musa's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his dark eyes. Something she couldn't quite name. Did you think about me when you were in his bed? Zainab sucked in a sharp breath. The pain in his words was palpable. I didn't have a choice, she murmured. Musa exhaled harshly. You always had a choice, Zainab. You just didn't choose me. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Zainab lowered her gaze. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. Musa scoffed. Good. Because I don't have it to give. The finality in his voice should have sent her walking out the door, but she remained rooted to the spot. She had nowhere else to go. No home, no family willing to take her back. The world had moved on without her, and she had been left behind. Musa studied her for a long moment before sighing. I don't know why you're here, Zainab. But I won't turn you away. You can stay, for now. Hope flared in her chest, but she tamped it down. This was not a second chance at love. This was survival. And for the first time in years, she had to fight for it. Musa led Zainab to the back of the shop, where a small wooden door opened into a modest living space. It was nothing like the grand house she had once shared with Alhaji Ibrahim. No silk curtains or marble floors, just a single bed pushed against the wall, a wooden table, and shelves stacked with neatly folded fabric. This is where you'll stay, he said, his voice devoid of warmth. It's not much, but it's better than the streets. Zainab nodded, her fingers brushing against the coarse fabric of the bed cover. It wasn't comfort she was looking for, it was shelter. Musa lingered for a moment before stepping back. I open the shop at sunrise. If you're staying here, you work. She looked up at him, surprised. You're giving me a job? He crossed his arms. It's better than pity. A small, unexpected smile touched her lips. He had always been like this, tough, direct, unwilling to hand out kindness where it wasn't earned. Thank you, she whispered. Musa didn't respond. He turned on his heel and left, the door closing behind him. Zainab quickly learned that working in Musa's shop was nothing like the life she had known before. Gone were the days of idle luxury, of servants preparing her meals and maids laying out her clothes. You said. Here, she rose with the sun, sweeping the shop floor before the first customers arrived. She stitched torn garments, arranged fabric rolls, and bargained with buyers who haggled until their voices rose above the clatter of the market. It was exhausting work, but for the first time in years, she felt useful. Musa, however, remained distant. He barely spoke to her unless it was necessary, keeping their interactions curt and professional. Some days, she caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression unreadable. But he never softened. One evening, as she closed the shop, she found him sitting outside, staring at the darkening sky. I never thought I'd see you work with your hands, he said suddenly. Zainab sat beside him, hugging her knees to her chest. I never thought I'd have to. Musa exhaled, shaking his head. Life is strange, isn't it? She glanced at him, the boy she had once loved, now a man who no longer trusted her. It is. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Finally, she asked, do you hate me? Musa didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I don't know." And somehow, that hurt more than if he had. The days turned into weeks. Zainab became part of the shop's daily rhythm, folding fabrics, handling customers, and even learning to sew simple designs. The work, though tiring, gave her a sense of purpose. It was nothing like the life she had once dreamed of, but it was hers now. Musa, however, remained as distant as ever. He spoke when necessary, gave instructions without emotion, and never once acknowledged the history they shared. But something was changing. She noticed it in the small things, the way his gaze lingered a second too long when she laughed with a customer, the way his hands sometimes twitched as if resisting the urge to reach for her. One evening, after a long day at the shop, she found herself alone with him again. The market was quiet, the last of the traders packing up their stalls. Zainab sat on the wooden bench outside, stretching her aching legs. Musa stood nearby, rolling up a piece of fabric. His movements were methodical, precise, until he suddenly stopped and let out a breath. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice low. Zainab blinked. "What do you mean?" "With Al-Haji Ibrahim." She stiffened. Of course, people would talk. A wealthy man discarding his wife was news that traveled fast. Musa turned to face her. "Why did you stay so long?" Zainab stared at her hands. "Because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" She sighed. "Of being nothing without him." Musa's jaw tightened. "You were never nothing, Zainab." She looked up, startled by the intensity in his voice. It was the first time in years he had spoken to her with something other than coldness. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of their past pressing between them. Then, just as quickly as it came, the moment passed. Musa turned away, gathering the fabric and moving toward the door. "Get some rest," he said. Zainab watched him go, her heart pounding. The ice was thawing. But was it enough to bridge the years that had come between them? The shift between them was subtle, almost imperceptible. Musa still kept his distance, but the air around them was no longer laced with unspoken anger. There were moments, brief, fleeting, where the past didn't feel like a gaping wound between them. One afternoon, as Zainab stitched the hem of a dress, an elderly woman entered the shop, her eyes scanning the fabric rolls. "Ah, Musa," she said, smiling. "Your wife works hard. I see why you chose her." Zainab's fingers froze on the needle. Musa, who had been arranging a stack of linen, stiffened. "She's not my wife." The old woman raised a brow. "Oh, but she moves like she belongs here." Zainab forced a small smile. "I'm just helping in the shop." The woman chuckled knowingly. A man does not let a woman stay close unless his heart still beats for her. She tapped Musa's shoulder before leaving. Silence stretched between them after she was gone. Zainab risked a glance at Musa, expecting him to dismiss the comment. But his expression was unreadable, his hands gripping the fabric tighter than necessary. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her. "Regret what?" "Not fighting harder for us." Musa finally turned, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite name. "I fought, Zainab. You were the one who walked away." Her heart clenched. "I didn't walk away. I was forced." "You made a choice," he interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "Maybe you thought it was the right one then. But you don't get to rewrite history now." Tears burned at the back of her eyes. "I never stopped loving you." Musa's gaze softened, just for a second, before he turned away. "That doesn't change anything." Zainab lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of the small room Musa had given her. The old woman's words echoed in her mind. A man does not let a woman stay close unless his heart still beats for her. But did Musa's heart still beat for her? Or was she clinging to a love that had died long ago? The next morning, she found him in the shop early, bent over a roll of fabric, measuring carefully. The sight stirred something deep within her, a memory of the boy who once dreamt of opening a shop of his own, of crafting fine garments with his own hands. She hesitated, then cleared her throat. "Musa." He didn't look up. "What is it?" "I want to talk." "Then talk." His tone was neutral, unreadable. She took a deep breath. "I know I hurt you. I know I made a choice that took me away from you. But you weren't there, Musa. You didn't see the pressure, the way my family. I was there, Zainab, he cut in, finally looking up. His dark eyes burned with emotion. I was there when you left me standing alone. I was there when you married him. His voice turned cold. I was there when you chose wealth over love. Zainab's breath hitched. It wasn't about wealth. It was about survival. Musa scoffed. And now that your survival has crumbled, you expect me to take you back. She flinched, but she didn't back down. I don't expect anything from you. Good, he muttered, turning back to his work. Silence stretched between them. But this time, Zainab refused to let it consume them. I want to make things right, she said softly. Musa let out a slow breath, his shoulders tense. Some things can't be fixed, Zainab. Her heart ached at his words. But she wasn't ready to give up, not yet. I'll keep working here, she said. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I want to prove to you that I'm not the same woman who left. Musa said nothing. But as she picked up a piece of fabric and began folding it, she could feel his eyes on her. Watching. Waiting. And maybe, just maybe, wondering if she was telling the truth. Days turned into weeks, and though Musa's coldness remained, the wall between them began to crack, just a little. Zainab worked tirelessly in the shop, handling customers with a grace she hadn't known she possessed. She learned to stitch with precision, bargain like a true market woman, and even cut fabric under Musa's watchful eyes. At first, he gave no praise. No acknowledgement. But then, one evening, as she carefully folded a freshly sewn garment, he muttered, "Not bad." It was barely a compliment, but it was the first sign that he was seeing her effort. Zainab clung to it. One night, the skies opened up, rain pouring down in sheets. The market emptied early, traders rushing to close their stalls before the downpour worsened. Zainab and Musa remained inside the shop, the heavy drumming of the rain filling the silence between them. She sat on a wooden stool, watching as he carefully threaded a needle. His hands, strong, steady, had always fascinated her. They had once held hers so tenderly, once traced love across her skin. Now, they barely touched her at all. "Musa," she said softly. He didn't look up. She hesitated. "Why haven't you married?" His hands stilled for a fraction of a second before he resumed sewing. "Not everyone is as eager as you to walk down the aisle." The sting of his words was sharp, but she refused to let them silence her. "That's not fair." He sighed, setting down the fabric. "What do you want me to say, Zainab? That I waited for you. That I spent years wondering if you'd come back." Her throat tightened. "Did you?" His jaw clenched. "It doesn't matter." She took a step closer. "It does to me." Musa finally met her gaze, and for the first time in a long time, she saw the truth beneath his anger, the hurt, the longing, the battle he fought within himself. "I loved you," he admitted, voice low, almost a whisper. "And you left." Tears welled in her eyes. "I never stopped loving you, Musa." He exhaled, shaking his head. "Love wasn't enough then. What makes you think it's enough now?" She had no answer. Because love alone had never been enough. And she didn't know if it ever would be. With what little dignity she had left, she packed her belongings and left. For the first time in years, she was free. But freedom came at a cost. With nowhere to go and no one to turn to, she found herself standing outside a familiar tailor's shop, one she had not dared approach in so long. Her heart pounded as the door creaked open. And there he was. Musa. Older. Stronger. His presence no longer that of a boy but a man hardened by time. His eyes flickered with shock, then something else, something unreadable. Zainab took a shaky breath. "Musa. I." He held up a hand, silencing her. His expression was unreadable, his jaw clenched. "You left me once, Zainab," he said quietly. "Why are you here now?" And just like that, the past crashed down around her. The days after their conversation were tense. Musa withdrew again, burying himself in work, speaking only when necessary. Zainab didn't push. She had already learned that Musa was like the Harmattan wind, unpredictable, capable of warmth one moment and biting cold the next. But something had shifted. One evening, as she closed the shop, a man entered, a trader from the next street. His eyes lingered on Zainab a little too long. "Zainab, right?" He smiled. "I've seen you around. Didn't expect to find you working here." She returned a polite smile. "Times change." He chuckled. "Indeed. A woman like you shouldn't be working in a shop, though. You deserve. Is there something you need?" Musa's voice cut through the moment like a blade. The trader raised his hands in surrender. "Relax, Musa. Just saying hello." He glanced at Zainab again, a knowing smirk on his lips, before walking out. Zainab turned to Musa. "That wasn't necessary." Musa exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "You don't know men like him. They see a woman alone and think she's easy prey." Her heart clenched. "I'm not alone." His gaze met hers, something unreadable flickering in his eyes before he looked away. "Lock up when you're done," he muttered before disappearing into the back. Zainab stood there for a long moment, fingers tightening around the edge of the wooden counter. Musa still cared. Maybe he didn't want to, maybe he fought it, but she saw it now, beneath the resentment, beneath the hurt. And she wasn't ready to let go of that hope just yet. A week later, just as Zainab was beginning to believe they were finding a fragile rhythm, the past came knocking. Literally. She was arranging fabric rolls when a shadow fell across the doorway. "Zainab." The voice froze her in place. Deep, familiar, laced with the authority of a man who had once owned her life. She turned slowly. Alhaji Ibrahim stood there, his expensive kaftan spotless despite the dust of the market, his sharp eyes scanning her with something between curiosity and amusement. "I never thought I'd see you working in a place like this." Zainab swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. Musa appeared at her side before she could speak, his presence solid, protective. "She doesn't belong to you anymore," he said coolly. Alhaji Ibrahim chuckled. "No, she doesn't. But that doesn't mean I can't check on an old friend." Zainab straightened, forcing steel into her spine. "I'm not your concern, Alhaji." His lips curved. "We'll see about that." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a chill that settled deep in Zainab's bones. She felt Musa watching her, his fists clenched at his sides. "He can't hurt you anymore," Musa said. But Zainab wasn't so sure. Because men like Alhaji Ibrahim didn't simply let go of what they once claimed. The encounter with Alhaji Ibrahim unsettled Zainab more than she wanted to admit. His presence was a reminder that no matter how much she tried to rebuild her life, the past had sharp claws, ready to pull her back at any moment. Musa noticed the way she withdrew that evening, how her hands trembled slightly as she folded fabric, how she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting Ibrahim to return. "He's gone," Musa said quietly, breaking the silence. Zainab nodded, but the tightness in her chest didn't ease. "You don't know him, Musa. He doesn't let things go easily." Musa leaned against the wooden counter, watching her closely. "What exactly happened between you two?" She hesitated. She had never spoken about it, not even to herself. But Musa's steady gaze made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt in years. Zainab exhaled. "At first, I thought he was kind. He gave me everything. Clothes, jewelry, a house so grand I sometimes felt like I was dreaming. But he never let me forget that I was his possession." Her voice wavered. "He controlled what I wore, where I went, who I spoke to. And when I displeased him," she swallowed hard. "He made sure I knew my place." Musa's fingers curled into fists. "Did he hurt you?" Her silence was answer enough. A muscle ticked in Musa's jaw. "If he comes near you again, I swear." "He's a powerful man, Musa," she interrupted, shaking her head. "You can't fight him." Musa's voice was low, dangerous. "Watch me." Zainab reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm, grounding him. "I don't want to fight. I just want to be free." Musa exhaled, his anger still simmering beneath the surface. But when he looked at her, there was something else in his eyes, determination. "You will be," he promised. "I won't let him take you back." Zainab believed him. But deep down, She knew that Alhaji Ibrahim was not a man who accepted defeat easily. And she feared that this was only the beginning. The encounter with Alhaji Ibrahim unsettled Zainab more than she wanted to admit. His presence was a reminder that no matter how much she tried to rebuild her life, the past had sharp claws, ready to pull her back at any moment. That night, a loud crash shattered the uneasy peace. Zainab bolted upright in bed, her pulse racing. Outside, the faint glow of flames flickered through the small window. The shop. She threw open the door, her feet barely touching the ground as she ran outside. Musa was already there, a bucket in hand, dousing the fire that had begun to lick at the wooden walls of his shop. The scent of burning fabric filled the air. Neighbors rushed in, tossing sand and water at the flames until the fire finally died, leaving behind a charred mess. Musa stood still, breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. A man stepped forward from the gathered crowd. I saw some men running off just before the fire started. Zainab didn't need to ask who had sent them. She knew. Musa turned to her, his voice low and controlled. Go inside. She shook her head. Musa. I said, go inside. Something in his tone made her listen. She retreated to the small room behind the shop, her hands trembling as she wrapped her arms around herself. Musa entered a few minutes later, his face shadowed with fury. This is war, he said grimly. Zainab swallowed hard. We can't fight him, Musa. His eyes burned into hers. Then what do you suggest? Running? She bit her lip. She had spent years running, from her family, from her marriage, from the consequences of the choices she had made. And now, even when she wanted to stand still, Alhaji Ibrahim was determined to push her back into the darkness. Musa sat down beside her, his hand brushing against hers. You're not alone this time. Tears stung her eyes. But what if being with me destroys everything you've built? His fingers curled around hers, firm and unyielding. Then we rebuild. Together. For the first time in a long time, Zainab allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could be enough. But she also knew Alhaji Ibrahim wasn't finished yet. And the next attack would be far worse. The next morning, Zainab and Musa sat in silence, the remnants of the burned shop a stark reminder of the battle they faced. The market buzzed with whispers, everyone knew who was behind the fire, but no one dared to say his name aloud. Zainab had spent years fearing Alhaji Ibrahim, but now, as she looked at Musa, at what they had lost and what they could still have, something inside her snapped. I won't let him control me anymore, she said firmly. Musa studied her, his jaw tight. What do you want to do? She met his gaze. End this. Zainab knew there was only one way to face Alhaji Ibrahim, on his terms. That evening, she sent a message through a market boy, requesting a meeting. The response was swift. The location, his estate. The time, midnight. Musa didn't like it. You're walking into a lion's den. I have to, she said. He won't stop unless he thinks he's won. Reluctantly, Musa agreed, but only on one condition. I'm coming with you. Alhaji Ibrahim's estate was as grand as Zainab remembered, the gates towering, the guards watching them like hawks as they were led inside. He sat in the center of the lavish room, dressed in a crisp white kaftan, his expression unreadable. Zainab, he greeted, sipping from a glass of wine. I knew you'd come back. She lifted her chin. I didn't come back, Alhaji. I came to finish this. He chuckled. Finish? My dear, you were never in control. His gaze flicked to Musa. And you, still playing the fool for a woman who abandoned you. Musa didn't flinch. A man like you wouldn't understand loyalty. Alhaji Ibrahim leaned forward. Loyalty? Do you think loyalty will protect her when I decide I've had enough of this game? Zainab took a deep breath, steadying herself. You don't have the power you think you do, Alhaji. People fear you, but they also resent you. And in a place like this, it only takes one person brave enough to speak for others to follow. His smirk faltered for the first time. She pressed on. You may own businesses, buy influence, silence those weaker than you, but you can't silence everyone. If anything happens to me, to Musa, the whole market will know. The whispers will grow into a storm, and not even your money will save you. His jaw tightened. Musa added, "You've already overplayed your hand, Ibrahim." The fire was sloppy. "The officers who came to shut down my shop. Everyone knew who sent them. You're losing control." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Al-Haji Ibrahim's face. Zainab leaned in, her voice steady. "You have a choice. Walk away now, or risk everything." A heavy silence settled in the room. Then, slowly, Al-Haji Ibrahim exhaled, swirling the wine in his glass before setting it down. "Clever girl," he murmured. He studied her for a long moment, then smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "Fine. You win this time." Relief flooded Zainab, but she didn't let her guard down. She knew men like him never truly admitted defeat. He gestured toward the door. "Get out." And they did. Days later, Musa's shop reopened, this time with the help of the very market people who had once feared Al-Haji Ibrahim. Fabric traders donated rolls of cloth, laborers helped rebuild, and the whispers of rebellion against the old power grew stronger. Zainab stood beside Musa, watching as customers returned, laughter and warmth filling the space once again. Musa turned to her, his eyes soft. "You could leave now, you know. Start over anywhere." She smiled. "I am starting over. Right here." His fingers brushed against hers, hesitant. She intertwined them, holding on this time. The past had tried to break them. But love, real, tested, unwavering, had survived. And this time, neither of them was letting go. The end.